Good evening, everyone. I know those applause are for the library, not for me. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones. My name is Salvatore Scavone, Weinberg Director of the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the library. As many of you know, the Cullman Center appoints 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive a stipend, an office in the center, and enhanced access to our collections so that they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the finest writers at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write books that we believe will make a major contribution to scholarship and literature, and that we believe will last. Tonight, we help launch Molly Crabapple's groundbreaking new history, Here Where We Live Is Our Country, the story of the Jewish Bund. Molly researched and wrote her book during her 2023-2024 term as a fellow at the Cullman Center. The New York Times wrote of it in a review out yesterday. Quote, "In this muddled moment, Molly Crabapple's terrific Here Where We Live Is Our Country unearths the story of a Jewish political movement that opposed ethnic nationalism of all stripes and that fought anti-Semites head-on. It's an authoritative history of the Jewish Labor Bund, thrillingly energetic." Molly Crabapple will discuss her book with the award-winning journalist, columnist, and internationally best-selling author Naomi Klein. Before their conversation begins, Emmy Award-winning musician Max Fractal will perform Shtil Di Nakht, a traditional Yiddish resistance song about fighting the Nazis during World War II. After about 35 minutes of discussion, our presenters will move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose one, please write it on the note card you received when you entered. Some of my colleagues will come by periodically during the talk to collect the cards if you have questions. If you're watching this online, you can put your question in the chat. Molly's book is for sale tonight over there, and after the talk, she'll be signing books over there. You can pick up a copy at the end of the talk if you didn't have a chance beforehand. Tonight's event is a collaboration of Conversations from the Cullman Center, which presents the books our fellows came here to write, and of Live from NYPL. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you. Thank you for that support, and thank you again for being here. Please join me in welcoming Max Fractal, to be followed by Naomi Klein and Molly Crabapple.
Thank you. Before I begin, I want to thank several people. As all of you know, writing a book is a collective endeavor, and this certainly is a work of many people, too many to thank, but I'll start with a few. First off, I want to thank my editor, Chris Jackson, the amazing Hiab Debasai, Catrice Campbell, Greg Kuby, and the entire team at One World Random House for publishing this book and for sticking with it when it grew into something far larger than I ever would have imagined. I want to thank my intrepid agent, Alice Whitwam, for always being my champion. I want to thank the Cullman Center, who gave me the room, the resources, and a place in this people's palace of knowledge. Without them, this book truly would not have been written. I want to thank my parents, both of who are here, and I want to thank Fred, my love. I also want to acknowledge the context that this event is taking place in. This is a book about valiant fighters against rising fascism. It's a book about the apocalypse and about a genocide. And we are doing this event in the context of genocide and of threatened apocalypse. Everyone here who has loved ones in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Iran, I see you and I stand with you, and I do not take your presence here for granted. Thank you. During his elder years, my great-grandfather, the post-impressionist artist Sam Rothbard, tried to paint back into existence the murdered world of his shtetl childhood. Amidst the hundreds of watercolors that he called memory paintings, one stood out. It was a girl, silhouetted against some cottages, her dress the same color as the twilight sky above. A moment before, she'd hurled a rock through one now shattered cottage window. On the painting's margin, her boyfriend offered more rocks. "Itka the Bundist breaking windows," Sam captioned the work. I may have been 15 or 17 or 20 when I saw that watercolor in my great-aunt's sun-baked living room or my mother's apartment. I don't recall exactly. What sticks with me is the old-world awkwardness of the heroine's name, Itka. I turned those Yiddish syllables on my tongue. And Bundist, what was that? This question became a thread that led me to the Bund, a revolutionary society of which my great-grandfather had been a member, whose story was interwoven with the agonies and triumphs of the Jews of Eastern Europe, and whose name has all but been erased. But this thread did not merely draw me back into the vanished past. It became a guide for our moment, in all its horror and possibility, in all its repression, courage, and loss. Founded in 1897 in the city of Vilna in the Russian Empire, and reaching its height in interwar Poland, the Bund was a sometimes clandestine political party whose tenets were humane, socialist, secular, and defiantly Jewish. Bundists fought the Tsar, battled pogroms, exalted the Yiddish language, and built vast networks of political and cultural institutions out of little more than love and grit. Seeking to liberate Jews from the poverty and violence of interwar Poland, they raised their children on the radical ethos of working-class solidarity and subaltern pride. Ultimately, these youth helped lead the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. Though the Bund was largely obliterated by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the group's opposition to Zionism better explains its absence from current consciousness. Though the Bund celebrated Eastern European Jews as a people, they irreconcilably opposed the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The diaspora was home, the Bund argued. Jews could never escape their problems by the dispossession of others. Instead, Bundists created the doctrine of Dokheit, or hearness. Jews had the right to live in freedom and dignity wherever it was they stood. They would fight for a better and more beautiful world, even alongside people they had been raised to see as their enemies. The more I dug into the Bundist past, the more I realized it was not past at all. It was rather a candle to illuminate the tumultuous present. Despite war and state collapse and genocidal repression, the Bund fought for the very multiracial democratic socialism that a new generation now champions at the ballot boxes. Bundists built alternate worlds of beauty, of courage, and of hope, which allowed their people to persevere even in the midst of the apocalypse. Their ideas are still vital today. The Bund was a Jewish group, but its history is not for Jews alone. It belongs to all of us who believe in the necessity of human solidarity. In the story of the Bund, across decades and geographies, ages and faiths, I found the story of our own time, a blueprint for survival, a cautionary tale of death, and a philosophy that might yet save us.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was so beautiful. Your book is gorgeous. It's such a privilege to be able to be here celebrating it on its birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Naomi.
I feel so intensely grateful for the labor of this book, the many years, the language you taught yourself, all of the time spent in the archives and in the real world, bringing us our ancestors when we need them most. So I want to thank you for that, because it's an incredible gift. You have been like this one-woman university out there teaching us. And I've been thinking, like, what is this role that you are playing? I've never seen anything like it. And then this image popped into my head of this sort of bougie suburban family just living their lives, and they get this knock on the door. They open the door, and it's the kid they never knew existed. And the kid says, "Daddy lied. There's a whole other family out there." And it's really awesome. So, thank you for being that for us, Molly. I sometimes refer to Molly as our time-traveling witch. So, one of the things you talk about is that there are multiple erasures that Zionism has inflicted. And the primary erasure is the attempt to erase Palestinian presence on the land and identity and culture. And that is an ongoing attempt and an extraordinarily violent attempt. But that there's also a secondary erasure, or maybe multiple erasures. And one of them is the erasure of Yiddishkeit and the Bund. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the way these erasures work together.
The first thing any ethno-nationalist, any fascist ideology has to do before it erases the other is it has to purify the self. It has to cut off the dissident, the solidaristic, the cosmopolitan parts of its own people's history. That's the first step. Now, of course, the worst thing Zionism did was not the erasures that it did against Jewish history. The worst thing that it did was the murders that it did against Palestinian, against Lebanese, against Arab life. But another crime that they did was that they erased our history. There's a myth that Zionists like to tell that before the creation of Israel, the whole nearly 2,000-year expanse of time between Jews getting forced out of Jerusalem by the Romans and the Nakba happening was nothing, that it was just dust. It was just the story of weak Jews being bullied and murdered and pogromed until finally they were all gassed in Auschwitz. That's the story they like to tell. And that the alternative is to be a strong Israeli, strongly and bravely oppressing Palestinians. And those are your choices, that you either live and oppress, or you don't oppress and you die. And that has always been a lie. And that lie is one of the things that accounts for the Bund's erasure. The Bund was a group that fought for their right to live and flourish in the Eastern European lands that they had been born in, that they had lived for 1,000 years. And I don't just mean they fought with op-eds and graduate school seminars, though they did. They did do that as well. And no slight against op-eds, I'm a writer of them. I mean that they fought with brass knuckles and with guns. They said, here where we live is our country. And there was always an implied motherfucker at the end of it.
Can you give us a sense of the thickness of Bundist culture, just how extensive it was, how present it was, how multifaceted?
Especially in interwar Poland, when the Bund was at its height, they created a beautiful, multifaceted world. They had a Boy and Girl Scouts movement. They had a sanatorium for tubercular slum kids that was the glory of the world. They had an entire school system, including night schools for Jewish teenagers that had never even been allowed to learn how to read. They had a women's movement that fought for birth control and free childcare. They had summer camps and hiking clubs and libraries and theaters and publishing houses. They had a newspaper that churned out not just political diatribes, but news from the socialist movement in China and about the Scottsboro Boys in Alabama, and then sandwiched that between avant-garde literature from around the world, avant-garde literature by Tagore or by German novelists in Weimar, Berlin, that were translated in Yiddish so the Jewish working class could understand it, because they believed that the working class deserved the very best in life. They had massive labor unions. They had May Day marches that encompassed 100,000 people. They ran for city council and they won. At one point, they were the most popular Jewish party in Poland. And they defended all of it with the force of arms through their militias. And when I think about what the Bund was in Poland, I can only think about the Black Panther Party in America, another group of young Marxists from a racialized class who both fought for international socialism and the liberation of their own people.
Now, you talked about hearness. I mispronounce it.
I always do, too.
Tell us more about what they meant by that, because we are in this moment of resurgent blood and soil nationalism. Zionism is one, but Christian nationalism right here in the United States is another. Every country has some form or another. So how does hearness differ, right? That attachment to place, but also a sense that it's portable in a way.
One of the Bund's primary concept, like their ethos, was an idea that they called hearness. Here where I live is my country. And the idea was that you had the right to live and not just merely be tolerated, but to flourish, have a beautiful life wherever it was you were, without having to cut off pieces of yourself, without having to change your name, to forget your language, to forget your God. And that everyone else did too, and that you could fight for a better and more beautiful world alongside people who were very different than you, and that you could love a place irregardless of where your supposed quote-unquote blood came from. They were staunch opponents of the idea of ethno-nationalism, of the idea that we all have to sort ourselves into little ethno-states, that we can never be whole or safe unless we are in the supposed land of our fathers. They instead fiercely loved their place because they were there. And sometimes when I walk the streets of New York City, the city I was born in, the city I've lived my whole life, I feel that hearness in me, that love of even the broken glass in the sidewalks.
One of the things that is really striking in reading this book and the history that you've unearthed is, there was a class war within Judaism, right? And I think there's been a flattening of interests within this mainstream story of what Jewishness means. And some of that might be because a lot of Jews, were no longer working class. But within this history, it's very clear that the Bundists did not believe they had the same interests as the factory owners, the landlords. What are some of the lessons that you learned from that history?
I mean, the Bundists, they had this idea that's almost like proto-intersectionality, in that they saw that they were oppressed both as Jews, they were, from a racialized class that had that on their passport, that had special laws restricting them, but also they were oppressed as workers, because capitalism oppresses workers. And they did not see their salvation in the form of their boss, who might have been a Jewish person, giving them a charity basket on a holiday. They saw their salvation in the form of trade unions, in the form of strikes, and in the form of working class solidarity. And I think that there's a story that gets told, which is like, in America, that's like, all Jews are upper middle class, all Jews are upwardly mobile, and it's not true, right? Like, my family wasn't like that. And I think that this class lens is one of the most important lenses with which we could view the world, not viewing things with like a fake solidarity based on calls to blood and soil, but rather with a sharp eye to what's really going on, to who the boss is and who the worker is.
I guess this is related to that question, but there's such a powerful sense of comradeship in the book that you have. This sort of, I guess an ancestral comradeship, and it felt like you were finding your people through history. What was that process like?
That's exactly what it felt like. I mean, finding my people, finding my antagonists too, sometimes. You sometimes find the disagreeable boys in history as well. And also finding people to fall a bit in love with. I mean, I write this book not as someone who is trying to like take fossils and clean up the bones and put them in a museum. I write this as someone who is a lifelong leftist, as someone who also knows what it's like to pass pamphlets to strangers and knock on doors to try to convince people, to try to organize them. I'm someone who knows what it's like to scrawl a message illegally on a wall and to get arrested. And I refused to write this book as if I was writing about people who were unknowable to me. These were not the triceratops roaming on the range, in like the pre-Ice Age era. These are our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and they're our comrades, even if we haven't had the chance to meet them, even if they're from another time.
So in the reading that you began with, you talked about the personal route into the story through your great-grandfather and a painting. And you've also spoken about another route into it through Palestine. How did Palestine bring you to this work?
I had the real privilege of getting to visit Palestine as a guest of the Palestine Festival of Literature in 2015. I got to read my work in Ramallah, travel all over the West Bank, and then I stayed some time extra, and I had the almost inconceivable privilege of being able to visit Gaza, where I still have friends today. And I think it's impossible to sit at a West Bank checkpoint or to sit on a balcony in Gaza and listen to the drones buzz above you and feel the profound smallness, the prison-like smallness of the place, and not have a profound disgust for the ideology that created this system. I had known my great-grandfather was a member of something that he called the underground, because he wrote about that, and I grew up obsessed with my great-grandfather. I grew up surrounded by his paintings, his sculptures, photos of him hanging from a chin-up bar, and I even knew about the Bund from the painting Itka the Bundist. But it was after I got back from Palestine, I was doing one of my vices, which is drunkenly Googling at night, and drunk Wikipediaing, and I learned that the Bund was an anti-Zionist group, not merely a group that was devoted to making trouble and overthrowing the Tsar. And that, I think, was the spark, where I was like, why don't I know more about this?
So the research process was extraordinary, more exhaustive than I fully understood.
It was deranged, is what I would say it is.
Tell us some stories. I mean, in the text, there's a really moving vignette of you returning to this forest outside Vilna, which was the site of terrible violence. Can you describe that, and maybe also just whatever you want to share about what you did to write this book?
I'll start with the broad, and then I'll talk about what happened in Ponar Forest. I wrote this book as an act of love and necromancy, and because of that, I think I did much more than almost anyone but a true maniac would have. I learned Yiddish. I translated countless books for myself from Yiddish, including the most deadly dull socialist prose that anyone has ever suffered through. Geschichte von Bund. I read every single book in English and Spanish about the Bund. There were Spanish books too. I hired research assistants to translate memoirs in Polish and Russian. I had access to memoirs that were printed by people's family members, like Sofia Dubnova's memoir, Bread and Matzah, memoirs that other people didn't necessarily have access to. I spent weeks, months in archives spinning the bobbins of microfilm like a little wicked witch at her spinning wheel. I went to Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and I went to Ukraine during the Russian invasion, because even if the architecture of the world that the Bund had lived in had long been burnt and rebuilt, I wanted to see the wildflowers that grew there. I always read stuff by the Bund's enemies as well as their friends, because I know what fantasists, leftists are. I fact-check the dead. They're slippery too. But the story that Naomi is bringing up, it's about one of my characters, Patty Kremer. Patty Kremer was an amazing woman who was the wife of the Bund's founder, Arkady Kremer, and she would have been at the founding conference, except she had been arrested and she was in jail. And she was what was called a tuer, a doer, someone who actually did the organizational work of the movement as opposed to yapping at conferences. And I loved her for her wit, for her humor, for her skepticism. And one of the things that I did was Patty Kremer was murdered in the pits in Ponar Forest outside of Vilna, where the Lithuanian population of Vilna enthusiastically collaborated with the Nazis to murder tens of thousands of their Jewish neighbors in these pits. And witnesses said that Patty Kremer, who was an old woman at this point, while she was waiting at the pit with her comrades, she told them, "Let's sing the Bund's anthem so death won't seem so terrible." And I still remember how this death was described in the socialist, in Geschichte von Bund, where they said, "Our Patty died like a socialist, proud and unafraid." And so I went to Ponar Forest, where those pits were, and they're so large. They're larger than you could ever imagine. And I gathered flowers, and I climbed down to the bottom of one of them, and I laid the flowers there. You don't know which pit was hers, obviously. And I played that song. It's called The Oath. I played it on my phone, and I just listened to it all alone while the forest echoed around me, and I felt her there.
Thank you. there's such a sense of embodiment, and I think that type of research is very, very rare. And I think you brought your full sensibility as an artist in the way that you did this research. But that story, it reminds me so much of Walter Benjamin, and one of the last, probably his last work before he took his own life, fleeing the Gestapo rather than be captured in 1940. Theses on the Concept of History. He talks about defeat, and he talks about, he sort of offers himself up, his generation up. He says all that we have to offer now is defeat, but he's not saying, it's not nothing. It's being offered up. I mean, this is his concept of now time, but this idea that in these revolutionary moments, that there's power in the past, that there's an accumulation of revolutionary attempts, including the unsuccessful ones. So I wonder about that, about your feeling about what we can plant in that soil, I suppose.
The Bund was defeated, obviously. They were defeated by the greatest war machines of their era, just like all the Jews of Europe were defeated, and just like all the leftist movements of Europe were defeated. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing to learn from them. And I could talk about all of the practical things you could learn about building a beautiful movement, making a culture that is so seductive that people of all walks of life want to join it. I could talk about lessons in toughness, in bravery. I could talk about cautionary tales about infighting, because there's a lot of infighting and a lot of flouncing off the stage and abnegating your power when you really ought to have stayed on there. But the thing that I really take from the Bund story is I take their ethos, their commitment to solidarity across difference, the idea that you could fight for the better and more beautiful world alongside people who are utterly different from yourself. And as the world plunges into barbarism, I know that solidarity, the Bund's sort of solidarity, is the only thing that can save us.
It feels slightly surreal to be having this conversation with you in public about the book that now exists in the world, because we've been having this conversation for so long, and you've been teaching me about the Bund for a very long time, and we met. It was 2022, I think. It was during the pandemic. I was writing Doppelganger, and you came up to visit me at V's house, upstate, and I was writing about anti-Semitism as a sort of seminal conspiracy theory, and you were telling me something that ended up in the book, which was about how the Tsar had used anti-Semitism to break apart the working class coalition after the unsuccessful Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution in 1905. And it strikes me that is a relevant story, even if it's not necessarily, what should we learn from that? What is that story, and what should we learn from it?
In 1905, after Tsarist troops gunned down a bunch of workers that were politely asking for basic dignity in front of the Winter Palace, a revolutionary wave swept the entire Russian Empire. And in the western borderlands, which is where Jews lived in the Russian Empire, the Bund threw themselves into this wave, and they became the kings of it in many ways. They were on the barricades of Lodz. Their orators were haranguing the crowds in Odessa, and they were both exemplifying and living a true working class revolutionary solidarity that had the potential to shatter an autocracy. And the revolutionary wave grew so strong that eventually general strikes forced the Tsar to give some extremely tiny concessions that bought off liberals. But at the same time, he unleashed a wave of pogroms, of 800 state-backed pogroms, and these are not a few people that being killed. I'm talking like 800 people murdered in the course of 3 days in Odessa. Pogroms that were so hideous that the black press in America was reporting on them weekly with absolute horror. And the reason that he did these pogroms was that the way that he thought that he could neutralize this revolutionary wave that almost toppled him was he said, your enemy isn't me. Your enemy is the Jew. And Jews and revolutionaries are the same. And don't take out your anger on me, take out your anger on them. He used racism as a wedge. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was printed and distributed by the Tsarist secret police with the express purpose of breaking solidarity between different groups and of turning the empire's anger on the Jews. And I think that this is relevant because today we see such anger with the billionaire class, this unaccountable billionaire class that has impoverished Americans. It's made it impossible for young people to own their own homes, that has had vast networks of sexual abuse, this billionaire class that never suffers consequences. And you see right-wing demagogues turn it and say, don't blame the billionaires, don't blame them, blame the Jews.
And I think about that every time I make the mistake of looking at Twitter and remember who owns it and how good it is for him that his platform has turned into this kind of cesspool of anti-Semitism, because when we're doing that, we're not talking about him. It could be our first trillionaire, right? So it is useful. I think I'm going to be getting some of your questions soon, but before we get there, I want to ask you, God, I have so much I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about the women. It's a very feminist book. There are so many incredible women in this book. And what surprised you about the role of women in the book? I mean, you knew, because you knew about Itka, that they had some badass women with her rocks and her boyfriend holding them. But it went well beyond that.
I mean, they had so many women leaders. You had women who were street orators, who smuggled weapons, who led self-defense militias, like Nadezhda Grinfeld in Odessa. You had women who were writing sex columns, telling men not to suck so much. You had women who were smuggling pamphlets taped to their bodies, like fake pregnant bellies. And you had women who were leading, who were in city council, who were beloved orators, who were icons. And okay, this is a little fun fact about it. In Tsarist Russia, in the Bund's early years when they were illegal, women made up about a third of leadership. And this was because to advance back in the days of illegality, you had to be very physically brave. Because if you even got caught with pamphlets, right, you could be sent to Siberia. And women were really brave. They were really good at smuggling guns, at giving these like illegal street speeches. They were really tough and brave. But then in interwar Poland, when the Bund was legalized, bravery stopped being the litmus test, and instead it was about being really loud at conferences. And that was when the female share of leadership shrunk.
Amazing. So you talked about hearness and this philosophy, and you also said at the start that while this is a Jewish story, that the lessons are universal potentially. And I would love to hear you talk more about what that commitment and love of place has to teach us about this moment, because I think we see it. I think we saw it in Minneapolis when people just defended their neighbors so incredibly powerfully and with such courage. And I think the city displayed it in the 100,000 volunteers who worked to elect Zoran Mamdani as part of a mayoral campaign that was really, as many have observed, a love letter to the city to hear, or to the diversity and complexity. And so, I mean, one of the things I think about with this idea of hearness is that here isn't stable, right? I mean, people have to move sometimes, and that then becomes fuel for the ethno-nationalists. But what could hearness mean as a universal ethos?
I think that it's a commitment to your street, to your block, to your neighbors, to the old lady that you deliver packages for, to the patch of poisoned grass that you try to coax into growing roses, to the bodega, to the guy outside of the bodega who hollers at you, but you like him anyway, to the lived fabric of life with all of us together, not leaving any of us out, no matter how irritating we sometimes are. And this commitment to say, like, this is ours. It's all of ours. It does not merely belong to the rich. You know, capital right now wants so much to displace us. It wants so much to make sure that you can never own your apartment, that you can never stay in it. It wants to make sure that you can never actually plant roots in your neighborhood. It wants to make cities as sterile and white as iPhone packaging, like smooth tubes through which money can glide. It deplores friction. But we all know that friction is the basis of pleasure. Friction is your lover's lips, right? Friction is you grabbing your comrade's hand. And when I think of what hearness means, it's a commitment to be here and to fight for it.
Sort through them.
They better be good. If they're dumb, I might mock them.
Okay, while I look at them, I want you to talk about this literal here, this library, this building, which, as you said, is the People's Palace. It is public luxury incarnate. Look at it. Look at this room. Look at what's possible when you tax billionaires. Let them run from state to state. They'll eventually run out. Look what's happening. Okay, I'm not gonna make any jokes about Dubai. Okay, you wrote this book in big parts of this book in this building, and you also wrote a lot of it after October 7th during a time of genocide. Just describe that to us a little while I look at these.
Well, first I'll talk about this building. I cannot tell you how cool the Cullman Center Fellowship is. It is by far the best writers fellowship in the world. So what they do is they financially support you and give you a room, and they have like little elves bring any book in their entire collection, which is like 50 million books. But there's a catch, which is that your room has a glass wall, and Salvatore, the guy who introduced us, can see you, and he can see if you're not writing in your room. And wrath will come on you if you don't write in your room. So you have to write. You can't just like dick off to Paris or something and squander all the money on blow like some people would. And that is how I finished the book. I finished this book because of the Cullman Center Fellowship, dead up. I was tormenting myself and going in circles, and also I've never like had my own room. Like me and Fred share one space, and you know how psycho writers are, you like literally have a breakdown if someone breathes near you. So I was tormenting myself over this book, and then I got the Cullman Center Fellowship, and it gave me the space to write it. That's the truth. I would go in every single day. I lived off of coffee from the machine and the novelty bags of fun chips that they would give us. And I wrote, and I chased up every footnote and stacks of printed out scholarly articles materialized for me thanks to the amazing Cullman Center staff, and I did it. Thank you. Thank you so much to the Cullman Center. This book is so much yours. And thank you to Salvatore for keeping us all honest.
I personally tried to lure Molly away, and she couldn't. She was like, I can't. He'll know. All right. There's a cluster of questions about Israel and Palestine, and I want to I'm going to read you these three, and you can take them as a group. Did Zionism always espouse displacement and violence, or did that develop later? Why does Zionism appeal to elite class interests? Could you talk more about by what process Zionism erased the Bundist movement? And then, how do you respond to the argument that if the Bundists had emigrated to Palestine, they would have survived?
I'll start with the last one first, because I've been getting a lot of Twitter trolls saying it, though in much more vulgar ways. Anyone who emigrated anywhere out of Europe survived. If you emigrated to Moscow because you were a diehard Stalinist and somehow you didn't end up in a gulag, you survived. If you emigrated to Australia, you survived. If you emigrated to Rio de Janeiro, skipping your marriage, you survived. The reason that Jews died in Europe is because the genocidal Nazi death machine killed 2/3 of European Jews, and there was not anything special about Palestine that protected Jews more than Australia or Rio de Janeiro or Delhi or New York City. And in fact, the truth is that if Palestine had not been a British colony, if it had not been under the protection of the British Empire, and if the British Empire had not stopped Rommel's armies at El Alamein, the Jews in Palestine would have been murdered, just like all of the Jews in Poland and France. And you cannot derive ethics from luck, from historical contingency. That's the first thing. I don't think that Zionists always conceived of what they were doing as being based on ethnic cleansing. I remember I was reading Ber Borochov, who was the founder of Labor Zionism, also someone who'd never been to Palestine, and he was like, yeah, it's gonna work out great. It's gonna be just like Liberia. Because, in Liberia, it's working out so great because, African Americans, they're like the brothers of the Kru people in Liberia, and we're the brothers of the Arabs, and look at this model. The thing is, I think that it's one thing what people thought, right, when they're living in Russia and they're writing pamphlets. People think all sorts of stuff when they're writing pamphlets. What matters isn't like what you're writing in your pamphlets. What matters is what happens in reality. And the truth was that there was no way to create a Jewish majority state in Palestine, which was a place that was overwhelmingly Palestinian Arab, without ethnic cleansing.
I think one of the things that is really powerful and important about what you do in the book is you really do you get into the psychology of why people would come to that extraordinarily bleak and cynical conclusion, right?
Of course. I utterly understand why people supported Zionism. It was not because they were like evil monsters at that time. It was because they were people living in a Europe that was insane over ethno-nationalism, a Europe that could not tolerate diasporic people, and not just Jews. Look at what Europe did to the Roma people as well. This was a Europe that thought that everyone had to have their neat little state, and that neat little state had to be homogenous, and they all had to worship the same God and speak the same language and build their cathedrals in the same style and cross themselves with the same number of fingers. And God forbid there was any variation. This is a Europe where the Greeks and Bulgarians ethnically cleansed each other, right? This was a Europe where Poles and Ukrainians ethnically cleansed each other. It was a Europe that was soaked in this bloody logic of ethno-nationalism, and it saw no place for Jews, just like it saw no place for Roma and other diasporic people. And I can utterly see how if you're born in a country and people from the time that you are conscious are acting like you're a subhuman bacillus who should be eliminated, and their whole way of understanding the world is every person has a country, and that country has to match with their blood. I understand why you would become a Zionist. It's just, there's so many things that you can understand emotionally as a human, but that doesn't mean they're good political programs.
So there are a few questions asked in different ways, forgive me, about what you would like contemporary movements to learn from the Bund. And maybe this question relates to that, which was what was your thinking on integrating art into the narrative? How did you want graphics to interact with the mostly narrative historical work?
I'm an artist. It's just what I do. I can't help myself, sorry. I wanted to show what people looked like. Now, okay, here's one thing that I think you can really learn from the Bund. There's so many things, but this is something I think is really important, is that the Bund created alternate world that appealed to every type of people. It did not just appeal to intellectuals. It was not grad student pilled. It was not entirely dominated by people who wanted to go to socialist summer school and analyze Grundrisse. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It also had like soccer clubs, right? And it had theater troupes. And it had like really hot chicks. A lot of people joined the Bund because they had really hot chicks in cool uniforms. And it was incredibly fun. And I think that one of the things that the left needs to do more of, and one of the things that Zoran's campaign did so effectively, was it needs to realize that the world is made up of all sorts of different people, and many of them are not grad students. And I know, it's shocking, right? And that you have to appeal to all sorts of different people. You have to appeal to people who like sports. You have to appeal to people who like rude podcasts where they say problematic things. You have to appeal to theater kids. You have to appeal to hot girls who like fashion and fishnet stockings. You have to appeal to all sorts of people in this world, right? Because this world belongs to all of us, and that's how we win.
Okay, we are running out of time. And I think that some of you are going to want to get your book signed by Molly, so I don't want to eat into any of that. This has been such a delight. Molly is going to grace us with one last reading and a final note to end on. But I just want to say thank you so much for being here. It's so wonderful to have Molly's parents here, the people who made you who you are. I think I see a future congressman.
I do.
Brad Lander, let's go.
The heir to Meyer London.
Over to you, Molly.
Okay, they were right, one friend told me after he finished my manuscript. Right and dead. What's the big lesson you wanted to take away from all this? After all, the Bund failed. Lost, I answered, more sharply than I meant. What's the difference between failed and lost, he responded. Failure is what happens to those overcome by their own faults and errors. To lose is to succumb to greater force. Here I confess a secret. I didn't just write this book out of scholarly devotion. I had a hidden hope. By studying the Bund story, I wanted to find out if there was some way that my people, the Jews of Eastern Europe, could have saved themselves. The more I wrote, the more I realized the wrongness of my premise. Though individuals escaped in various ways, there was no way out for Eastern European Jews as a collective, not as long as they were fighting alone. No small minority could have rescued themselves from the horrors of the 20th century. Despite astounding feats of heroism, cunning, and creativity, they couldn't hold Hitler back, nor the intractable hatred of so many of their Christian neighbors. The Bund could not change the balance of force. Neither could any other Jewish group in Eastern Europe, whether assimilationist or Zionist, capitalist or communist, Hasidic or Christian convert. 9 million scattered humans can't defeat vast armies of organized killers. The accusation of failure isn't one we should level against the Bund or any other Jewish group of that place and time. It's for the Western world of which they were such a precarious part. It was the West, after all, that hypocritically paid lip service to freedom and humanity while hewing to the crude doctrines of might. The true failures were the democracies who played nice with Hitler in the early years, then shut their doors to Jewish refugees who fled from the hell they helped enable. The failures were the British and American diplomats who hobnobbed in Bermuda while the Warsaw Ghetto burned. The Western world failed the Jews of Europe when they refused to provide the basic solidarity that their historical moment demanded, the solidarity upon which the Bund's humanism relied. This betrayal allowed Zionism to present itself as the only possible salvation. If the world came down to strong predators and weak victims, Zionism at least offered Jews the possibility of strength. But Zionism is ethno-nationalism. Like all ethno-nationalism, It required mass murder to clear the land to build its dream. On this haunted territory, oppressed became oppressors. 70-odd years after they struck their state upon another people's ruin, the inheritors of Zion would liquidate their very own ghetto in Gaza, beside the sea. For ethno-nationalism, this is what winning means. So why did I write this book about the Bund, who lost, who were failed, and not about victorious killers? Because I am sick of monsters, whether they belong to my own group or any other. Because I know we all have the capacity to be victims and tormentors, as well as bystanders staring blankly at a burning wall. Because I want off this samsara wheel of atrocity, and the Bund's demand of solidarity across difference is the only way we get there. Such solidarity is fragile, and it is frequently betrayed, but it is all we have. It is the only thing that can save us. There is no other earth after all. We are trapped together on this one. It belongs to all of us as inheritance and prison. It is Egypt and the Promised Land. Before you all go and buy every single copy of those books over there, which I know you're going to do, I want to tell you that Jewish Voices for Peace is having a Seder in the streets tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. in front of City Hall, and I'll be there. I hope to see some of you too.
Here, I'm going to give you all the